Chapter 8. I stood on the hilltop and looked down at the house. There was shrubbery all about me, so I was not especially obtrusive. I did not really know what I expected to see. A burned-out shell, a car in the driveway, a family scattered about the redwood patio furniture, armed guards. I saw that the roof could use some new slate, that the lawn had long ago returned to a natural condition. I was surprised that I could only see one broken window there in the rear. So the place was supposed to look deserted. I wondered. I spread my jacket on the ground and seated myself on it. I lit a cigarette. There were no other houses for quite a distance. I had gotten close to $700,000 for the diamonds. It had taken me a week and a half to make the deal. From Antwerp, we had traveled to Brussels, spending several evenings at a club on the Rue de Charpayne, before the man I wanted found me. Arthur was quite puzzled by the arrangement. A slight, white-haired man with a neat mustache, ex-RAF officer, Oxonian. He began shaking his head after the first 2 minutes and kept interrupting me with questions about delivery. While he was no Sir Basil Zaharoff, he became genuinely concerned when a client's ideas sounded too half-baked. It troubled him if something went sour too soon after delivery. He seemed to think it reflected back on him in some way. For this reason, he was often more helpful than the others when it came to shipment. He was concerned about my plans for transportation because I did not seem to have any. What one generally requires is an arrangement of this sort, and an arrangement of this sort is an end-use certificate. What it is, basically, is a document affirming that Country X has ordered the weapons in question. You need the thing in order to get an export permit from the manufacturer's country. This keeps them looking honest, even if the shipment should be reconsigned to Country Y once it crossed their border. The customary thing to do is buy the assistance of an ambassadorial representative of Country X, preferably with one with relatives or friends connected to the Defense Department back home, in order to get the papers. They come high, and I believe Arthur had a list of all the going rates in his head.
"But how are you going to ship them?" he kept asking. "How will you get them where you want them?"
"That," I said, "will be my problem. Let me worry about it." But he kept shaking his head.
"It is no good trying to cut corners that way, Colonel," he said.
I'd been a colonel to him since we had first met some dozen years before. Why, I'm not certain.
"No good at all. I tried to save a few dollars that way, and you might lose the whole shipment and wind up in real trouble. Now I can fix you up with one of these young African nations quite reasonably."
"No, just fix me up with the weapons." During our talk, Ganelon just sat there drinking beer, as red-bearded and sinister-looking as ever, and nodding to everything that I said. As he spoke no English, he had no idea as to the state of negotiations. Nor, for that matter, did he really care. He followed my instructions, though, and spoke to me periodically in Thari, and we would chat briefly in that language about nothing in particular. Sheer perversity. Poor old Arthur was a good linguist, and he wanted to know the destination of the pieces. I could feel him straining to identify the language each time that we spoke. Finally, he began nodding as though he had. After some more discussion, he stuck his neck out and said,
"I read the newspapers. I'm certain his crowd can afford the insurance."
And that was almost the price of admission to me. "But, no," I said. "Believe me, when I take possession of these automatic rifles, they're going to vanish off the face of the earth."
"Neat trick, that," he said, "considering I don't even know where we'll be picking them up yet."
"It does not matter."
"Confidence is a fine thing. Then there is foolhardiness." He shrugged. "Have it as you say, then. Your problem."
Then I told him about the ammo, and he must have been convinced as to my mental deterioration. He just stared at me for a long while, not even shaking his head this time. It was a good 10 minutes before I could even get him to look at the specifications. It was then that he began shaking his head and mumbling about silver bullets and inert primers. The ultimate arbiter, Cash, convinced him that he would do it my way. However, there was no trouble on the rifles or the trucks, but persuading an arms factory to produce my ammo was going to be expensive, he told me. He was not even certain he could find one that would be willing. When I told him that the cost was no object, it seemed to upset him even more. If I could afford to indulge in weird, experimental ammo, an end-use certificate would not come to that much. No, I told him, no. My way, I reminded him. He sighed and tugged at the fringe of his mustache. Then he nodded. Very well, we would do it my way. He overcharged me, of course. Since I was rational in all other matters, the alternatives to psychosis would be that I was party to an expensive boondoggle. While the ramifications must have intrigued him, he apparently decided not to look too far into a sticky-seeming enterprise. He was willing to seize every opportunity I extended for dissociating himself from the project. Once he found the ammo people, a Swiss outfit as it turned out, he was quite willing to put me into contact with him and wash his hands of everything but the money. Ganelon and I went to Switzerland on fake papers. He was a German and I was Portuguese. I did not especially care what my papers showed, so long as the forgery was of good quality. But I had settled on German as the best language for Ganelon to learn, since he had to learn one, and German tourists always had a way of being all over the place. He picked it up quite rapidly. I told him to tell any real Germans and any Swiss who asked that he'd been raised in Finland. We spent 3 weeks in Switzerland before I was satisfied with the quality controls in my ammo. As I suspected, the stuff was totally inert in this shadow. I'd worked out the formula, though, which was all that really mattered at that point. The silver came high, of course. Perhaps I was being overcautious. Still, there are some things about amber that are best dispatched with that metal, and I could afford it. For that matter, what better bullet, short of gold, for a king? Should I wind up shooting Eric, there'd be no less majesté involved. Indulge me, brothers. Then I left Ganelon to shift for himself for a time, since he had thrown himself into his tourist role in true Stanislavskian fashion. I saw him off to Italy, camera about his neck and a faraway look in his eyes, and I flew back to the States. Back, yes. That run-down place on the hillside below me had been my home for the better part of a decade. I'd been heading toward it when I was forced off the road and into the accident which led to everything which has since occurred. I ruined my cigarette and regarded the place. It had not been run down then. I'd always kept it in good shape. The place had been completely paid for. 6 rooms and an attached 2-car garage. Around 7 acres. The whole hillside, actually. I'd lived there alone most of the time. I liked it. I spent most of my time in the den and in my workshop. I'd wondered whether the Mori woodcut still hung in the study. Face to Face, it was called. And it depicted 2 warriors in mortal combat. It'd be nice to have it back. It would be gone, though, I felt. Probably everything that had not been stolen had been sold for back taxes. I imagined that was what the state of New York would do. I was surprised that this house itself seemed not to have acquired new occupants. I kept watching to make certain. Hell, I was in no hurry. There was no place else I had to be. I'd contacted Gerard shortly after my arrival in Belgium. I decided against trying to talk with Benedict for the time being. I was afraid that he would simply try to attack me, one way or the other, if I did. Gerard had studied me quite carefully. He was out somewhere in open country, and he seemed to be alone. "Corwin," he said then. "Yes." "Right. What happened with Benedict? I'll be real with you, I don't remember what voice I gave Gerard last time."
"I found him just as you said he would be, and I released him. He was set to pursue you once again, but I was able to persuade him that a considerable time had passed since I had seen you. Since you said that you left him unconscious, I gathered that would be the best line to take. Also, his horse was very tired. We went back to Avalon together. I remained with him through the funerals, then borrowed a horse. I am on my way to Amber now.
Funerals? What funerals? Again, that calculating look.
You really do not know, he said.
If I knew, damn it, I would not ask.
His servants, they were murdered. He says you did it.
No, I said. No, that is ridiculous. Why would I want to murder his servants? I do not understand.
It was not long after his return that we went looking for them, as they were not on hand to welcome him. He found them murdered and you and your companion gone.
Now I see how it looked, I said. Where were the bodies?
Buried, but not too deeply, in the wood behind the garden to the rear of his house.
Just so, just so. Better not to mention I had known about the grave. But what possible reason does he think I could have for doing such a thing? I protested.
He is puzzled, Corwin.
Very puzzled now. He could not understand why you did not kill him when you had the chance, and why you sent for me when you could have just left him there. I see now why he kept calling me a murderer as we fought, but... Did you tell him that what I had said about not having slain anyone? Yes. At first he shrugged it off as a self-serving statement. I told him you sounded sincere and very puzzled yourself. I believe it bothered him a bit that you should be so insistent. He asked me several times whether I believed you.
Do you?
He dropped his eyes. Damn it, Corwin! What am I supposed to believe? I came into the middle of this. We've been apart for so long. He met my gaze. There is more to it, he said.
What is it?
Why did you call me to help him? That was a complete deck you took. You could have called any of us.
You must be joking, I said.
No, I want an answer.
Very well, you're the only other one I trust.
Is that all?
No. Benedict does not want his whereabouts known back in Amber. You and Julian are the only two I know for certain to be aware of his location. I don't like Julian, and I don't trust him, so I called you.
How did you know that Julian and I knew about him?
He helped both of you up when you ran into trouble on the Black Road a while back, and he put you up while you recuperated. Dara told me about it.
Dara? Who was this Dara, anyway?
The orphan daughter of a couple who once worked for Benedict, I said. She was around when you and Julian were there.
And you sent her a bracelet. You also mentioned her to me by the road back when you summoned me.
Correct. What is the matter?
Nothing. I do not really remember her, though. Tell me, why did you leave so suddenly? You have to admit it seemed the act of a guilty man.
Yes, I said. I was guilty, but not of murder. I went to Avalon to obtain something that I wanted. I got it, and I cleared out. You saw that wagon, and you saw that I had cargo in it. I got out before I returned to keep on answering questions Benedict might ask me about it. Hell, if I just wanted to run, I wouldn't go dragging a wagon along behind me. I would have traveled on horseback, fast and light.
What was in the wagon?
No, I said. I did not want to tell Benedict, and I do not want to tell you. Oh, we can find out, I suppose, but let him do it the hard way, if he must. It is immaterial, though. The fact that I went there for something and really obtained it should be sufficient. It is not especially valuable there, but it is in another place. Fair enough?
Yes, he said. It does make a kind of sense.
Then answer my question. Do you think I murdered them?
No, he said. I believe you.
What about Benedict now? What does he think?
He would not attack you again without talking first. There was doubt in his mind. I know that.
Good. That's something anyway. Thank you, Gerard. I'm going away now. I moved to break the contact. Wait, Colvin, wait. What is it?
How did you cut the Black Road?
You destroyed a section of it at the place you crossed over. How did you do it? The pattern, I said. If you ever get in trouble with that thing, hit it with the pattern. You know how sometimes you have to hold it in your mind if shadows begin to run away from you and things start going wild?
Yes, I tried that and it didn't work.
All I got was a headache. It is not of shadow. Yes and no, I said.
I know what it is. You did not try hard enough. I used the pattern until it felt as if my head were being torn apart, until I was half blind from the pain and about ready to pass out. Then the road came apart about me instead. It was no fun, but it did work. I will remember, he said. Are you going to talk to Benedict now? No, I said. He already has everything we've gone over. Now that he is cooling off, he'll begin pushing the facts around some more. I would just as soon he do it on his own, and I do not want to risk another fight. When I close this time, I will be silent for a long while. I will resist all efforts to communicate with me also. What of Amber, Colwyn? What of Amber? I dropped my eyes. Don't get in my way when I come back, Gerard. Believe me, there'll be no contest. Colwyn, wait. I'd like to ask you to reconsider. Do not hit Amber right now. She is weak in all the wrong ways. I'm sorry, Gerard, but I'm certain I've given the matter more thought during the past 5 years than all the rest of you put together. I'm sorry too, then. Guess I'd better be going now. He nodded. Goodbye, Colwyn. Goodbye, Gerard. After waiting several hours for the sun to disappear behind the hill, leaving the house in a premature twilight, I mashed a final cigarette, shook out my jacket and donned it, rose to my feet. There had been no signs of life about the place, no movement behind the dirty windows, the broken window. Slowly I descended the hill. Flora's place out in Westchester had sold some years before, which came as no surprise to me. I checked merely as a matter of curiosity since I was back in town. I'd even driven past the place once. There was no reason for her to remain on this shadow earth. Her long wardenship having ended successfully, she was being rewarded in amber the last time I had seen her. To have been so near for as long as I had without even realizing her presence was a thing I found somewhat galling. I debated contacting Random, but decided against it. The only way he could possibly benefit me would be with information as to the current affairs in Amber. And while this would be nice to have, it was not absolutely essential. I was fairly certain that I could trust him. After all, he had been of some assistance to me in the past. Admitted it was hardly altruism, but still, he'd gone a bit further than he had had to. It was 5 years ago, though, and a lot had happened since. He was being tolerated around Amber again, and he had a wife now. He might be eager to gain a little standing. I just did not know. But weighing the possible benefits against the possible losses, I thought it better to wait and see him personally the next time I was in town. I kept my word and resisted all attempts to make contact with me. They had come almost daily during my first 2 weeks back in the Shadow Earth. Several weeks had passed, though, and I had not been troubled since. Why should I give anyone a free shot at my thinking machinery? No thanks, brothers. I advanced upon the rear of the house, sidled up to a window, wiped it with my elbow. I'd been watching the place for 3 days, and it struck me as very unlikely that anyone was inside. Still, I peered in. It was a mess, of course, and a lot of my stuff was missing, but some of it was still there. I moved to my right and tried the door. Locked. I chuckled. I walked round to the patio. 9th brick in, 4th brick up. The key was still beneath it. I wiped it on my jacket as I walked back. I let myself in. There were coffee containers, sandwich wrappers, and the remains of a petrified hamburger in the fireplace. A lot of weather had found its way down that chimney in my absence. I crossed over and closed the damper. I saw that the front door had been broken about the lock. I tried it. It seemed to be nailed shut. There was an obscenity scrawled across the wall in the foyer. I walked on into the kitchen. It was a total mess. Anything that had survived the plunder was on the floor. The stove and the refrigerator were gone. The floor scarred where they had been pushed along. I backed away, went and checked my workshop. Yes, it had been stripped. Completely. Passing on, I was surprised to find my bed, still unmade, and 2 expensive chairs, all intact in my bedroom. My study was a more pleasant surprise. The big desk was covered with the litter and muss, but then it always had been. Lighting a cigarette, I went and sat behind it. I guess it was just too heavy and bulky for anyone to make off with. My books were all on their shelves. Nobody steals books but your friends. And there, I could not believe it. I got to my feet again and crossed the room to stare at close range. Yoshitoshi Mori's beautiful woodcut hung right there where it had always been. Clean, stark, elegant, violent. To think that no one had made off with one of my most prized possessions. Clean? I scrutinized it. I ran my finger along the frame. Too clean. It bore none of the dust and grit which covered everything else in the house. I checked it for tripwires, found none, removed it from its hook, and lowered it. No, the wall was no lighter behind it. It matched the rest of the wall perfectly. I put Mori's work on the window seat and returned to my desk. I was troubled, as someone doubtless intended me to be. Someone had obviously removed it and taken good care of it, a thing for which I was not ungrateful, and then only just recently restored it. It was as if my return had been anticipated. What should be adequate reason for immediate flight, I suppose, but that was silly. If it was part of some trap, then it had already been sprung. I jerked the automatic from my pocket and tucked it behind my belt. At night, I had not even known that I'd be coming back myself. It was just something I had decided to do, since I had some time on my hands. I was not even certain as to why I wanted to see the place again. So, this was some sort of contingency arrangement. If I should come by the old homestead, it might be to obtain the only thing in the place worth having. So, preserve it and display it, so that I will have to take notice. All right, I had. I hadn't been attacked yet, so it did not seem a trap. What then? A message. Some sort of message. What? How? And who? The safest place in the house, had it remained unravaged, should still be the safe. It was not beyond any of my siblings' skill. I moved to the rear wall, pressed the panel loose, and swung it out. I spun the dial through its combination and stepped back, opened the door with my old swagger stick. No explosion. Good. Not that I had expected any. There had been nothing of any great value inside. A few $100s in cash, some bonds, receipts, correspondence. An envelope. A fresh white envelope lay in plain sight. I did not remember it. My name upon it, written in an elegant hand, not with ballpoint either. It contained a letter and a card.
Brother Corwin, the letter said, that if you are reading this, then we still think enough alike for me to be able to anticipate you somewhat. I thank you for the loan of the woodcut, one of two possible reasons, as I see it, for your returning to this squalid shadow. I am loath to relinquish it, as our tastes are also somewhat akin, and it has graced my chambers for several years now. There is something to the subject that strikes a familiar chord. It returns to be taken as evidence of my goodwill and a bid for your attention, and that I must be honest with you if I am to stand a chance of convincing you of anything. I will not apologize for what I should have done. Vanity it was that played me for a fool. While time may have healed your eyes, I doubt it will ever significantly alter our feelings for one another. Your letter, I'll be back, lies upon my writing table at this moment. Had I written it, I know that I would be back. Some things being equal between us, I anticipate your return, and not without somewhat of apprehension. Knowing you for no fool, I contemplate your arriving in force. And here is where past vanity is paid of present pride. I would have peace between us, Corwin, for the sake of the realm, not my own. Strong forces out of shadow have come to beset Amber regularly, and I do not fully understand their nature. Against these forces, the most formidable in my memory ever to assail Amber, the family has united behind me. I would like to have your support in this struggle. Failing that, I request that you forbear invading me for a time. If you elect to assist, I require no homage of you, simply acknowledgement of my leadership for the duration of the crisis. You'll be accorded your normal honors. It is important that you contact me to see the truth of what I say. As I have failed to reach you by the means of your trump, I enclose my own for your use. While the possibility that I am lying to you is foremost in your mind, I give you my word that I am not. Eric, Lord of Ember. I reread it and chuckled. What did you think curses were for, anyway? No good, my brother. It was kind to think of me in your moment of need, and I believe you, never doubt it, for we are all of us honorable men. But our meeting will come according to my schedule, not yours. As for Amber, I am not unmindful of her needs, and I will deal with them in my own time and fashion. You make the mistake, Eric, of considering yourself necessary. The graveyards are filled with men who thought they could not be replaced. I will wait, though, to tell you this, face to face. I tucked his letter and the trump in my jacket pocket. I killed my cigarette in the dirty ashtray on my desk. Then I fetched some linen from the bedroom to wrap my combatants. They would wait for me in a safer place this time. As I passed through the house once again, I wondered why I had come back, really. I thought of some of the people I had known when I had lived there, and wondered whether they ever thought of me. Whether they wondered what had become of me. I would never know, of course. Night had begun, and the sky was clear, and its first stars bright as I stepped outside and locked the door behind me. I went around to the side and returned the key to its place beneath the patio. Then I mounted the hill. When I looked back from the top, the house seemed to have shrunken there in the darkness, to have become a piece of the desolation, like an empty beer can tossed aside the road. I crossed over and down, heading across a field toward the place where I had parked, wishing I had not looked back. Chapter 9. Avalon and I departed Switzerland in a pair of trucks. We had driven there from Belgium, and I had taken the rifles in mine. Figuring 10 pounds per piece, the 300 had come to around 1.5 tons, which was not bad. After we took on the ammo, we still had plenty of room for fuel and other supplies. We had taken a shortcut through Shadow, of course, to avoid the people who waited on the borders to delay traffic. We departed in the same fashion, with me in the lead to open the way, so to speak. I led us through a land of dark hills and narrow villages, where the only vehicles we passed were horse-drawn. Then the sky grew bright lemon. The beasts of burden were striped and feathered. Striped and feathered, sorry. We drove for hours, finally encountering the Black Road, paralleling it for a time, then heading off in another direction. The skies went through a dozen shiftings, and the contours of the land melted and merged from hill to plain and back again. We crept along poor roads and skidded on flats as smooth and hard as glass. We edged our way across a mountain's face and skirted a wine-dark sea. We passed through storms and fogs. It took me half a day to find them once again, or a shadow so close that it made no difference. Yes, those whom I had exploited once before. They were short fellows, very hairy, very dark, with long incisors and retractable claws, but they had trigger fingers, and they worshipped me. They were overjoyed at my return. It little mattered that 5 years earlier I had sent the cream of their manhood off to die in a strange land. The gods are not to be questioned, but loved, honored, and obeyed. They were quite disappointed that I only wanted a few hundred. I had to turn away thousands of volunteers. The morality of it did not especially trouble me this time. One way of looking at it might be that by employing this group, I was seeing to it that the others had not died in vain. Of course, I did not look at it that way, but I enjoy exercises in sophistry. I suppose I might also consider them mercenaries being paid in spiritual coin. What difference did it make whether they fought for money or for a belief? I was capable of supplying either one when I needed troops.
Actually, though, these would be pretty safe, being the only ones in the place with firepower. My ammo was still inert in their homeland, however, and it took several days of marching through shadow to reach a land sufficiently like amber for it to become functional. The only catch was that shadows follow a law of congruency of correspondences, so that the place was actually close to amber. This kept me somewhat on edge throughout their training. It was unlikely that a brother would blunder through that shadow. Still, worse coincidences have occurred. We drilled for close to 3 weeks before I decided we were ready. Then, on a bright, crisp morning, we broke camp and moved on into shadow, the columns of troops following behind the trucks. The trucks would cease to function when we neared amber. They were already giving us some trouble, but they might as well be used to haul the equipment as far along as possible. This time I intended to go over top of Colvier from the north, rather than essay its seaward face again. All of the men had an understanding of the layout, and the disposition of the rifle squads had already been determined and run through in practice. We halted for lunch, ate well, and continued on, the shadows slowly slipping away about us. The sky became a dark but brilliant blue, the sky of amber. The earth was black among rocks and the bright green of the grass. The trees and the shrubs had a moist lucency to their foliage. The air was sweet and clean. By nightfall, we were passing among the massive trees at the fringes of Arden. We bivouacked there, posting a very heavy guard. Ganelon, now wearing khakis and a beret, sat with me long into the night, going over the maps I had drawn. We still had about 40 miles to go before we hit the mountains. The trucks gave out the following afternoon. They went through several transformations, stalled repeatedly, and finally refused to start at all. We pushed them into a ravine and cut branches to cover them over. We distributed the ammo and the rest of the rations and continued on. We departed the hard, dirt roadway after that, and worked our way through the woods themselves. As I still knew them well, it was less of a problem than it might have been. It slowed us, naturally, but lessened chances of surprise by one of Julian's patrols. The trees were quite large. As we were well into Arden proper, and the topography sprang back into mind as we moved. We encountered nothing more menacing than foxes, deer, rabbits, and squirrels that day. The smells of the place and its green, gold, and brown brought back thoughts of happier times. Near sunset, I scaled a forest giant and was able to make out the range that held Colvier. A storm was playing about its peaks just then, and its clouds hid their highest portions. The following noon we ran into one of Julian's patrols. I did not really know who surprised whom, or who was more surprised. The firing broke out almost immediately. I shouted myself hoarse, stopping it, as everyone seemed anxious to try out his weapon on a live target. It was a small group, 12 men, and we got all of them. We suffered only one minor casualty, from one of our men wounding another. Or perhaps the man had wounded himself. I never got the story straight. We moved on quickly then, because we had made the hell of a racket, and I had no idea as to the disposition of other forces in the vicinity. We gained considerable distance and altitude by nightfall. The mountains were in sight whenever there was a clear line of vision. The storm clouds still clung to their peaks. My troops were excited over the day's slaughter, and took a long while getting to sleep that night. The next day we reached the foothills, successfully avoiding 2 patrols. I pushed us on and up well after nightfall to reach a place of cover I had had in mind. We bedded down at an altitude perhaps half a mile higher than we had the previous night. We were under the cloud cover, but there was no rainfall. Despite a constant atmospheric tension of the sort that precedes a storm, I did not sleep well that night. I dreamed of the burning cathead and of Lorraine. In the morning, we moved out under gray skies, and I pushed the troops remorselessly, heading steadily upward. We heard the sounds of distant thunder, and the air was alive and electric. About mid-morning, as I led our file up a twisted, rocky route, I heard a shout from behind me, followed by several bursts of gunfire. I headed back immediately. A small knot of men, Ganalong among them, stood staring down at something, talking in low voices. I pushed my way through. I could not believe it. Never in my memory had one been seen this near to Amber. Perhaps 12 feet in length, bearing that terrible parody of a human face on the shoulders of a lion, eagle-like wings folded above its now bloody sides, a still twitching tail like that of a scorpion. I had glimpsed the manticora once in isles far to the south, a frightful beast that had always held its spot near the top of my unclean list.
"It tore Raoul in half. It tore Raoul in half," one of the men kept repeating. About 20 paces away, I saw what was left of Raoul. We covered him over with a tarp and weighed it down with rocks. That was really about all we could do. If nothing else, it served to restore a quality of wariness that had seemed to vanish after the previous day's easy victory. The men were silent and cautious as we continued on our way.
"Quite a thing, that," Ganelon said. "Has it the intelligence of a man?"
I do not really know.
I've a funny, nervous feeling, Colvin, as though something terrible is about to happen. I don't know how else to put it.
I know.
You feel it too?
Yes. He nodded. Maybe it's the weather, I said. He nodded again, more slowly. The sky continued to darken as we climbed, and the thunder never ceased. Flashes of heat lightning occurred in the west, and the winds grew stronger. Looking up, I could see great masses of clouds about the higher peaks. Black, bird-like shapes were constantly outlined against them. We encountered another manticora later, but we dispatched it with no damage to ourselves. About an hour later, we were attacked by a flock of large, razor-beaked birds, the like of which I had never seen before. We succeeded in driving them off, but this, too, disturbed me. We kept climbing, wondering when the storm was going to begin. The winds increased in velocity. It grew quite dark, though I knew the sun had not set yet. Excuse me, sorry. The air took on a misty, hazy quality as we neared the cloud clusters. A feeling of dampness worked its way into everything. The rocks were more slippery. I was tempted to call a halt, but we were still a good distance from Colvire, and I did not want to strain the ration situation, which I had calculated quite carefully. We achieved perhaps another 4 miles and several thousand feet in elevation before we were forced to stop. It was pitch black by then, the only illumination at all coming from the intermittent flashes of lightning. We camped in a large circle on a hard, bare slope, sentries all about the perimeter. The thunder came like long flourishes of martial music. The temperature plummeted. Even had I permitted fires, there was nothing burnable about. We settled down for a cold, clammy, dark time. The manticoras attacked several hours later, sudden and silent. 7 men died and we killed 16 of the beasts. I have no idea how many others fled. I cursed Eric as I bound my wounds and wondered from what shadow he had drawn the things. During what passed for morning, we advanced perhaps 5 miles toward Colvire before bearing off toward the west. It was one of the 3 possible routes we could follow, and I had always considered it the best for a possible attack. The birds came to plague us again several times, with greater numbers and persistency. Shooting a few of them, though, was all it took to rout the entire flock. Finally, we rounded the base of a huge escarpment, our way taking us outward and upward through thunder and mist, until we were afforded a sudden vista, sweeping down and out for dozens of miles across the valley of Garnath that lay to our right. I called a halt and moved forward to observe. When last I had seen that once lovely valley, it had been a twisted wilderness. Now things were even worse. The black road cut through it, running to the base of Colvire itself, where it halted. A battle was raging within the valley. Mounted forces swirled together, engaged, wheeled away. Lines of foot soldiers advanced, met, fell back. The lightning kept flashing and striking among them. The dark birds swept about them like ashes on the wind. The dampness lay like a cold blanket. The echoes of the thunder bounced about the peaks. I stared, puzzling, at the conflict far below. The distance was too great for me to determine the combatants. At first it occurred to me that someone else might be about the same thing I was, that perhaps Blaze had survived and returned with a new army. But no. These were coming in from the west, along the Black Road. And I saw now that the birds accompanied them, in bounding forms that were neither horses nor men. The manticoras, perhaps. The lightnings fell upon them as they came, scattering, burning, blasting. As I realized that they never struck near the defenders, I recalled that Eric had apparently gained some measure of control over the device known as the Jewel of Judgment, with which Dad had exercised his will upon the weather about Amber. Eric had employed it against us with considerable effect 5 years earlier. So the forces from Shadow about which I have been hearing reports were even stronger than I had thought. I had envisioned harassment, but not a pitched battle at the foot of Colvir. I looked down at the movements within the blackness. The road seemed almost to writhe from the activity about it. Ganelon came and stood beside me. He was silent for a long while. I did not want him to ask me, but I felt powerless to say it, except as an answer to a question.
What now, Corbin?
We must increase the pace, I said. I want to be in Amber tonight. We moved again. The going was better for a time, and that helped. The storm without rain continued, its lightnings and thunders increasing in brilliance and volume. We moved through a constant twilight. When we came to a safe-seeming place later that afternoon, a place within 5 miles of the northern skirts of Amber, I halted us again, for rest and a final meal. We had to scream at one another in order to be heard, so I could not address the men. I simply passed the word along concerning our proximity and the need for readiness. I took my rations with me and scouted on ahead while the others rested. About a mile further along, I mounted a steep upturn, pausing when I achieved its crest. There was a battle of some sort in progress on the slopes ahead. I kept out of sight and observed. A force out of Amber was engaged with a larger body of attackers, which must have either preceded us up the slope or arrived by different means. I suspected the latter, inasmuch as we had seen no signs of recent passage. The engagement explained our own good fortune in not encountering defensive patrols on the way up. I moved nearer. While the attackers could have come up by one of the other 2 routes, I saw additional evidence that this need not have been the case. They were still arriving, and it was a most fearsome sight, for they were airborne. They swept in from the west like great gusts of wind-blown leaves. The aerial movement I had witnessed from the distance had been of greater variety than the belligerent bird life. The attackers came in on winged, 2-legged dragon-like creatures, the closest parallel with which I was familiar being the heraldic beast, the wyvern. I had never seen a non-decorative wyvern before, but then I had never felt any great desire to go looking for one. Among the defenders were numerous archers, who took a deadly toll of these in flight. Sheets of pure hell erupted among them also, as the lightnings flashed and flared, sending them like cinders toward the ground. But still they came on, landing so that both man and beast could attack those entrenched. I looked for and located the pulsing glow given off by the Jewel of Judgment when it had been tuned to operate. It came from the midst of the largest body of defenders, dug near the base of a high cliff. I stared and studied, focusing on the wearer of the gem. Yes, there could be no doubt. It was Eric. On my belly now, I crawled even farther. I saw the leader of the nearest party of defenders behead a landing wyvern with a single sword stroke. With his left hand, he seized the harness of its rider and hurled him over 30 feet, out beyond the lip-like brink of the place. As he turned then to shout an order, I saw that it was Gerard. He appeared to be leading a flanking assault on a mass of the attackers who were assailing the forces at the foot of the cliff. On its far side, a similar body of troops was doing likewise. Another of my brothers. I wondered how long the battle had been in progress, both in the valley and here above. Quite a while, I guessed, considering the duration of the unnatural storm. I moved to the right, turning my attention to the west. The battle in the valley continued unabated. From this distance, it was impossible to tell who was who, let alone who was winning. I could see, though, that no new forces were arriving from out of the west to supplement the attackers. I was perplexed as to my own best course of action. Clearly, I could not attack Eric when he was engaged in anything this crucial to the defense of Amber herself. Waiting to pick up the pieces afterward might be wisest. However, I could already feel the rat teeth of doubt at work on that idea. Even without reinforcements for the attackers, the outcome of the encounter was by no means clear-cut. The invaders were strong, numerous. I had no idea as to what Eric might have in reserve. At that moment, it was impossible for me to gauge whether war bonds for Amber would be a good investment. Sorry, I lost my spot. Hold on, while I'm here, let's check and see how much we got left. About 10 pages. If Eric lost, it would then be necessary for me to take on the invaders myself, after much of Amber's manpower had been wasted. If I were to move in now with automatic weapons, there would be little doubt in my mind that we would crush the Wyvern riders quickly. For that matter, one or more of my brothers had to be down in the valley. A gateway for some of my troops could be set up by means of the trumps. It would surprise whatever was down there for Amber suddenly to come up with riflemen. I returned my attention to the conflict nearer at hand. No, it was not going well. Excuse me. I speculated as to the results of my intervening. Eric would certainly be in no position to turn on me. Besides, any sympathy that might be mine for what he had put me through, I would be responsible for pulling his nuts out of the fire. While he would be grateful for the relief, he would not be too happy over the general sentiment this would arouse. No, indeed. I would be back in Amber with a very deadly personal bodyguard, and a lot of goodwill going for me. An intriguing thought. It would provide a far smoother route to my objective than the brutal frontal assault culminating in regicide that I had had in mind. Yes. I felt myself smiling. I was about to become a hero. I must grant myself a small measure of grace, however. Given the choice, only between Amber with Eric on the throne and Amber fallen, there is no question but that my decision would have been the same to attack. Things were not going well enough to be certain, and while it would work to my advantage to save the day, my own advantage was not, ultimately, essential. I could not hate thee, Eric, so much loved I not Amber more. I withdrew and hurried back down the slope, flashes of lightning hurling my shadow in every which direction. I halted at the periphery of my encampment. At its farther edge, Ganelon stood in shouting converse with a lone horseman, and I recognized the horse. I advanced, and at a sign from its rider, the horse moved forward, winding its way among the troops and heading in my direction. Ganelon shook his head and followed. The rider was Dara. As soon as she was within earshot, I shouted at her, "What the hell are you doing here?" She dismounted, smiling, and stood before me. "I wanted to come to Amber," she said, "and so I did." "How did you get here?" "I followed Grandpa," she said. "It is easier to follow someone through shadow, I discovered, than to do it yourself." "Benedict is here?" She nodded. "Down below. He's directing the forces in the valley. Julian is there, too." Ganelon came up and stood near.
She said that she followed us up here, he shouted. She has been behind us for a couple of days.
Is that true? I asked. She nodded again, still smiling.
It was not hard to do.
But why did you do it?
To get into amber, of course. I want to walk the pattern. That is why you are going, isn't it? That is where you are going, isn't it?
Of course it is. But there happens to be a war in the way.
And what are you going to do about it?
Win it, of course.
Good. I'll wait.
I cursed for a few moments to give myself time to think. Then, where were you when Benedict returned? I asked. The smile went away.
I do not know, she said. I was out riding after you left, and I stayed away the entire day. I wanted to be alone to think, and when I returned in the evening, he was not there. I rode again the following day. I traveled quite a distance, and when it grew dark, I decided to camp out. I do that often. The next afternoon, as I was returning home, I came to the top of the hill and saw him passing below, heading to the east. I decided to follow him, but the way led through shadow. I understand that now, and you were right about it being easier to follow. I do not know how long it took. Time got all mixed up. He came here, and I recognized it from the picture on one of the cards. He met with Julian in a wood to the north, and they returned together to the battle below.
She gestured toward the valley.
I remained in the forest for several days, not knowing what to do. I was afraid of getting lost if I tried to backtrack. Then I saw your force climbing the mountains. I saw you and I saw Ganelon at their head. I knew Amber lay that way, and I followed. I waited until now to approach because I wanted you to be too near to Amber to send me back when I did.
I don't believe you're telling me the whole truth, I said, but I haven't the time to care. We're going ahead now, and there will be fighting. The safest thing for you will be to remain here. I will assign you a couple of bodyguards.
I do not want them.
I don't care what you want. You're going to have them. When the fighting is over, I will send for you. I turned then and selected 2 men at random, ordering them to remain behind and guard her. They did not seem overjoyed at the prospect.
What are those weapons your men bear?
Dara asked. Later. I'm busy. I relayed a sketchy briefing and ordered my squads.
You seem to have a very small number of men, she said.
They are sufficient, I replied. I will see you later. I left her there with the guards. We moved back along the route I had taken. The thunder ceased as we advanced, and the silence became less a thing of relief than of suspense to me. The twilight resettled about us, and I perspired within the damp blanket of air. I called a halt before we reached the first point from which I had observed the action. I returned to it then, accompanied by Ganelon. The wyvern riders were all over the place, and their beasts fought along with them. They are pressing the defenders back against the cliff face. I sought for, but could not locate, Eric or the glow of his jewel.
Which ones are the enemy?
Ganelon asked me. The beast riders. They were all of them landing now that Heaven's artillery had let up. As soon as they struck the solid surface, they charged forward. I searched among the defenders, but Gerard was no longer in sight. Bring up the troops, I said, raising my rifle. Tell them to get the beasts and the riders both. Ganelon withdrew, and I took aim at a descending wyvern, fired, and watched it swoop, turn into a sudden flurry of pennons. It struck against the slope and began to flop about. I fired again. The beasts began to burn as it died, and soon I had 3 bonfires going. I crawled up to my second previous position. Secure, I took aim and fired once more. I got another, but by then, some of them were turning in my direction. I fired the rest of my ammo and hastened to reload. Several of them had begun moving toward me by then, and they were quite fast. I managed to stop them and was reloading again when the first rifle squad arrived. We put down a heavier fire and began to advance as others came up. It was all over within 10 minutes. Within the first 5, they had apparently realized that they hadn't a chance, and they began to flee back toward the ledge, launching themselves into space and becoming airborne again. We shot them down as they ran, and the burning flesh and smoldering bones lay everywhere about us. The moist rock rose sheer to our left, its summit lost in the clouds, so that it seemed as if it might tower endlessly above us. The winds still whipped the smoke and the mists, and the rocks were smeared and splashed with blood. As we advanced, firing, the forces of Amber quickly realized that we represented assistance, and began to push forward from their position at the base of the cliff. I saw that they were being led by my brother Cain. For a moment our eyes locked across the distance, then he plunged ahead into the fray. Scattered groups of Amberites united into a second force as the attackers fell back. Actually, they limited our field of fire when they attacked the far flank of the wizened beastmen and their wyverns, but I had no way of getting word of this to them. We drew closer and our firing was accurate. A small knot of men remained at the edge of the base of the cliff. I had a feeling they were guarding Eric, and that he had possibly been wounded, since the storm effects had ceased abruptly. I worked my own way off in that direction. The firing was already beginning to die down as I drew near the group, and I was hardly aware of what happened next until it was too late. Something big came rushing up from behind me and was by in an instant. I hit the ground and rolled, slinging my rifle to bear automatically. My finger did not tighten on the trigger, however. It was Dara, who had just plunged past me on horseback. She turned and laughed as I screamed at her. "Get back down there! Damn you, you'll be killed!" "I'll see you in Amber," she cried, and she shot on across the grisly rock and made it up the trail that lay beyond. I was furious, but there was nothing I could do about it just then. Snarling, I got back to my feet and continued on. As I advanced upon the group, I heard my name spoken several times. Heads turned in my direction. People moved aside to let me pass. I recognized many of them, but I paid them no heed. I think that I saw Gerard at about the same time that he saw me. He had been kneeling in their midst, but he rose to his feet and waited. His face was expressionless. As I drew nearer, I saw that it was as I had suspected. He had been kneeling to tend an injured man who rested upon the ground. It was Eric. I nodded to Gerard as I came up beside him, and I looked down on Eric. My feelings were quite mixed. The blood from his several chest wounds was very bright, and there was a lot of it. The jewel of judgment, which still hung on a chain about his neck, was covered with it. Eerily, it continued its faint glowing pulsation, heart-like beneath the gore. Eric's eyes were closed, his hand resting upon a rolled-up cloak. His breathing was labored. I knelt, unable to take my eyes off of that ashen face. I tried to push my hate aside just a little, since he was obviously dying, so that I might have a better chance to understand this man who was my brother for the moments that remained to him. I found that I could muster up something of sympathy by considering all that he was losing along with his life and wondering whether it would have been me lying there if I had come out on top 5 years earlier. I tried to think of something in his favor, and all I could come up with were the epitaph-like words, "He died fighting for Amber." That was something, though, and the phrase kept running through my mind. His eyes tightened, flickered, opened. His face remained without expression as his eyes focused on mine. I wondered whether he even recognized me, but he said my name, and then, "I knew that it would be you." He paused for a couple of breaths and went on. "They saved you some trouble, didn't they?" I did not reply. He already knew the answer. "Your turn will come one day," he continued, "and then will be yours." He chuckled and realized too late that he should not have. He went into an unpleasant spasm of moist coughing. When it passed, he glared at me. "I could feel your curse," he said, "all around me, the whole time. You didn't even have to die to make it stick. Then, as if reading my thoughts, he smiled faintly and said, "No, I'm not going to give you my death curse. I've reserved that for the enemies of Amber, out there." He gestured with his eyes. He pronounced it then in a whisper, and I shuddered to overhear it. He returned his gaze to my face and stared for a moment, and then he plucked at the jewel about his neck. "The jewel," he said. "You take it with you, to the center of the pattern. Hold it up, very close, to an eye. Stare into it. Consider it as a place. Try to project yourself inside. You don't go, but there is experience. Afterward, you know how to use it." "How?" I began, but stopped. He had already told me how to attune it. Why ask him to waste his breath on how he figured it out? But he caught it and managed, "Dworkin's notes. Under fireplace. Then he was taken with another coughing spell, and the blood came out of his nose and his mouth. He sucked in a deep breath and heaved himself into a sitting position, eyes rolling wildly. "Acquit yourself as well as I have, bastard," he said, and then fell into my arms and heaved out his final bloody breath. I held him for several moments, and then lowered him into his former position. His eyes were still open, and I reached out and closed them. Almost automatically, I put his hands together atop the now lifeless Jim. I had no stomach to take it from him at that moment. I stood then, removed my cloak, and covered him with it. Turning, I saw that all of them were staring at me. Familiar faces, many of them, some strange ones mixed in. So many who had been there that night when I had come to dinner in chains. No, it was not the time to think like that. I pushed it from my mind. The shooting had stopped, and Ganelon was calling the troops back and ordering some sort of formation. I walked forward. I passed among the Amberites. I passed among the dead. I walked by my own troops and moved to the edge of the cliff. In the valley below me, the fighting continued, the cavalry flowing like turbulent waters, merging, eddying, receding, the infantry still swarming like insects. I drew forth the cards I had taken from Benedict. I removed his own from the pack. It shimmered before me, and after a time there was contact. He was mounted on the same red and black horse on which he had pursued me. He was in motion, and there was fighting all about him. Seeing that he confronted another horseman, I remained still. He spoke but a single word. "Bide," he said. He dispatched his opponent with 2 quick movements of his blade. Then he wheeled his mount and began to withdraw from the fray. I saw that his horse's reins had been lengthened and were looped and tied loosely about the remainder of his right arm. It took him over 10 minutes to remove himself to a place of relative calm. When he regarded me, and I could tell that he was also studying the prospect that lay at my back. "Yes, I'm on the heights," I told him. "We have won. Eric died in the battle." He continued to stare, waiting for me to go on. His face betrayed no emotion. "We won because I brought riflemen," I said. "I finally found an explosive agent that functions here." His eyes narrowed and he nodded. I felt that he realized immediately what the stuff was and where it had come from. "While there are many things I would want to discuss with you," I continued, "I want to take care of the enemy first. If you will hold the contact, I will send you several hundred riflemen." He smiled. "Hurry," he said. I shouted for Ganelon, and he answered me from only a few paces away. I told him to line the troops up, single file. He nodded and went off, shouting orders. As we waited, I said, "Benedict, Dara is here. She was able to follow you through shadow when you rode in from Avalon. He bared his teeth and shouted, "Who the..." Sorry.
"Who the hell is this Dara you keep talking about? I never heard of her till you came along. Please tell me. I would really like to know.
I smiled faintly. It's no good, I said, shaking my head. I know all about her. I have told no one else you have a great-granddaughter, though. His lips parted involuntarily, and his eyes were suddenly wide.
Corwin, he said, you are either mad or deceived. I've no such descendant that I know of. As for anyone following me here through shadow, I came on Julian's trump.
Of course. My only excuse for not tripping her up immediately was my preoccupation with the conflict. Benedict would have been notified of the battle by means of the trumps. Why should he waste time traveling when an instant means of transport was at hand? Damn, I said. She's in amber by now. Listen, Benedict. I'm going to get Gerard or Kane over here to handle the transfer of the troops to you. Avalon will come through also. Give them their orders through him. I looked around, saw Gerard talking with several of the nobles. I shouted for him with a desperate urgency. His head turned quickly, then he began running in my direction.
Corwin, what is it?
Benedict was shouting. I don't know, but something is very wrong. I thrust the trump at Gerard as he came up. See that the troops get through to Benedict, I said. Is Random in the palace?
Yes.
Free or confined? Free, more or less. There'll be some guards about. Eric still didn't trust him. I turned. Canelon, I called out. Do as Gerard here tells you. He's going to send you to Benedict down there. See that the men follow Benedict's orders. I have to get into amber now.
All right, he called back.
Gerard headed in his direction, and I fanned the trumps once more. I located randoms and began to concentrate. At that moment, it finally began to rain. I made contact almost immediately. Hello, Random, I said as his image came to life. Remember me? Where are you? He asked. In the mountains, I told him. We just won this part of the battle, and I'm sending Benedict the help he needs to clean up in the valley. Now, though, I need your help. Bring me across. I don't know, Corwin. Eric is dead. Then who was in charge? Who do you think? Bring me across. He nodded quickly and extended his hand. I reached out and clasped it. I stepped forward. I stood beside him on a balcony overlooking one of the courtyards. The railing was of white marble, and not much was blooming down below. We were 2 stories up. I swayed and he seized my arm. You're hurt, he said. I shook my head, only just then realizing how tired I was. I'd not slept very much the past few nights, that and everything else. No, I said, glancing down at the gory mess that was my shirt front. Just tired. The blood is Eric's. He ran a hand through his straw-colored hair and pursed his lips. So you did finally nail him, he said softly. I shook my head again. No, he was already dying when I got to him. Come with me now. Hurry, it's important. Where to? What is the matter? To the pattern, I said. Why, I am not certain, but I know that it is important. Come on. We entered the palace, moving toward the nearest stairwell. There were 2 guards at its head. They came to attention as we approached and did not attempt to interfere with our passage. I'm glad it's true about your eyes, Random said as we headed down. Do you see all right? Yes, I hear that you are still married. Yes, I am. When we reached the ground floor, we hurried to the right. There had been another pair of guards at the foot of the stair, but they did not move to stop us. Yes, he repeated, as we headed toward the center of the palace. You're surprised, aren't you? Yes. Thought you're going to get the year over with and be done with it. So did I, he said, but I fell in love with her. I really did. Stranger things have happened. We crossed the marbled dining hall and entered the long, narrow corridor that led far back through shadows and dust. I suppressed a shudder as I thought of my condition the last time I had come this way. She really cares for me, he said, like nobody else ever has before. I'm glad for you, I said. We reached the door and opened onto the platform, hiding the long, spiral stairway down. It was open. We passed through and began the descent. "I'm not," he said as we hurried around and around. "I didn't want to fall in love. Not then. We'd been prisoners the whole time, you know. How can she be proud of that?" "That is over now," I said. "You became a prisoner because you followed me and tried to kill Eric, didn't you?" "Yes, and then she joined me here." "I will not forget," I said. We rushed on. It was a great distance down, and there were only lanterns every 40 feet or so. It was a huge natural cavern. I wondered whether anyone knew how many tunnels and corridors it contained. I suddenly felt myself overwhelmed with pity for any poor wretches rotting in its dungeons, for whatever reasons. I resolved to release them all or find something better to do with them. Long minutes passed. I could see the flickering of the torches and the lanterns below. "There is a girl," I said, "and her name is Dara. She told me she was Benedict's great-granddaughter and gave me reason to believe it. I told her somewhat concerning Shadow, reality, and the pattern. She does possess some power over Shadow, and she was anxious to walk the pattern. When last I saw her, she was headed this way. Now Benedict swears she is not his. Suddenly, I am fearful. I want to keep her from the pattern, and I want to question her." "Strange," he said. "Very. I agree with you. Do you think she might be there now?" "If she is not, then I feel she will be along soon." We finally reached the floor, and I began to race through shadows toward the proper tunnel. "Wait!" Random cried. I halted and turned. It took me a moment to locate him as he was back toward the stairs. I returned. My question did not reach my lips. I saw that he knelt beside a large, bearded man. "Dead," he said. "A very thin blade. Good thrust. Just recently." "Come on." We both ran to the tunnel and turned up it. Its seventh side passage was the one we wanted. I drew Grace Wandir as we neared it, for that great dark metal-bound door was standing ajar. I sprang through. Random was right behind me. The floor of that enormous room is black and looks to be as smooth as glass, although it is not slippery. The pattern burns upon it, within it. An intricate, shimmering maze of curved lines, perhaps 150 yards long. We halted at its edge, staring. Something was out there, walking it. I felt that odd, tingling chill the thing always gives me as I watched. Was it Dara? It was difficult for me to make out the figure within the fountains of sparks that spewed constantly about it. Whoever it was had to be of royal blood, for it was common knowledge that anyone else would be destroyed by the pattern. And this individual had already made it past the grand curve and was negotiating the final complicated series of arcs that led toward the final veil. The firefly form seemed to change shape as it moved. For a time, my senses kept rejecting the tiny subliminal glimpses that I knew must be coming through to me. I heard Random gasp beside me, and it seemed to breach my subconscious dam. A horde of impressions flooded my mind. It seemed to tower hugely in that always unsubstantial seeming chamber. Then shrink, die down, almost to nothing. It seemed a slim woman for a moment, possibly Dara. Her hair lightened by the glow, streaming, cackling with static electricity. Then it was not hair, but great curved horns from some wide, uncertain brow, whose crook-legged owner struggled to shuffle hooves along the blazing way. Then something else, an enormous cat, a faceless woman, a bright-winged thing of indescribable beauty, a tower of ashes. "Dara!" I cried out. "Is that you?" My voice echoed back, and that was all. Whoever and whatever it was struggled now at the final veil. My muscles strained forward in unwilling sympathy with the effort. Finally, it burst through. Yes, it was Dara. Tall and magnificent now, both beautiful and somehow horrible at the same time. The sight of her tore at the fabric of my mind. Her arms were upraised in exultation, and an inhuman laughter flowed from her lips. I wanted to look away, yet I could not move. Had I truly held, caressed, made love to that? I was mightily repelled and simultaneously attracted as I had never been before. I could not understand this overwhelming ambivalence. Then she looked at me. The laughter ceased. Her altered voice rang out,
Lord Corwin, are you Liege of Amber now?
From somewhere I managed a reply. For all practical purposes, I said.
Good. Then behold your nemesis.
Who are you? What are you?
You will never know,
She said.
It is just exactly too late now.
I do not understand. What do you mean?
Amber, she said, will be destroyed.
And she vanished. What the hell, said Random then, was that? I shook my head. I do not know. I really do not know. And I feel that it is the most important thing in the world that we find out. He gripped my arm. Corwin, it meant it. And it may be possible, you know? I nodded. I know. What are we going to do now? I resheathed Grace Swandeer and turned back toward the door. Pick up the pieces, I said. I have what I thought I always wanted within my grasp now, and I must secure it. And I cannot wait for what is to come. I must seek it out and stop it before it ever reaches Amber. Do you know where to seek it? He asked. We turned up the tunnel. I believe it lies at the other end of the Black Road, I said. We moved on through the cavern to the stairs where the dead man lay and went round and round above him in the dark. And that is the end of Book 2 of the Chronicles of Amber, The Guns of Avalon. Next time, we'll start Book 3, Sign of the Unicorn. Sorry, I felt like I was doing a terrible job near the end there. My voice is killing me. It feels like I get better at taking the reading in general. Like, it doesn't make my voice... I mean, my voice feels weak, but at the same time, it feels like it feels okay. But it feels like my grasp on being able to make voices for characters is like slipping the longer I read. It feels like my voice just can't be fucked to bother with that. So, you know. Well, that was your double chappy, though. And next time I will... Whoops. Next time might also be a double chappy, actually, because chapter 1 is only like 3 pages, or like 5 pages. Chapter 2, how long is that? How long is chapter 2? Very long, apparently. Holy shit. 278, 57. About 20 pages, I guess. That's not too bad. I can probably manage that. We might do another double chappy tomorrow. Or not tomorrow. Whenever I feel good enough to record again. Well, anyhow. Thanks for joining me. My throat feels totally fucked up after that. So I'll just end it here, and I'll see you guys next time.